Fuller is on her way. We'll give her another couple of minutes to arrive before we get started. For those of you who are here, thank you for your punctuality. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a informational hearing of the Senate Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications. My name is Alex Padilla, chair of the committee. As mentioned, this is an informational hearing, not a bill hearing, to discuss or have an update on the decommissioning plans for the San Onofre nuclear generating station. We will be joined, I believe, in a few minutes by the vice chair of the committee, Senator Fuller, and possibly other members of the committee periodically as the hearing goes on. Welcome, Senator Hill. We're just getting started. For those of you who have been monitoring the committee's activities over the last session, you know that this is our third in a series of hearings on the topic of San Onofre. Last June, we considered the challenges of ensuring grid reliability and stability following the loss of the 2,000 megawatts of GHG-free electricity in Southern California. Our second hearing took place last August when we discussed the general process of decommissioning, including the roles of state and federal regulators and how radioactive waste could be safely stored for the anticipated decades to come. In that second hearing, we did touch on a specific plan that Southern California Edison, along with input from the other co-owners of San Onofre, would need to submit to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission within 2 years of closure of songs. And we made it known then that we didn't want the submission of that plan to be the next time we would hear about the key decision points on a decommissioning plan. And so that leads us to today's hearing. Where are we? And what are some of the key questions that are arising of the decommissioning plan that's coming together? We will focus on the regulatory documents necessary to be submitted as the decommissioning process is taking shape, with one eye on schedule and another eye on costs, and clearly a consideration of impacts to the surrounding communities and the environment. We are fully aware that the decommissioning process is a long, complex process. Our main witness today is a representative from Southern California Edison, who will provide details about the activities that have taken place to date, including to what level the local community has been engaged for input and information sharing. We'll explore the proposed plan for selecting and installing dry casks, and we'll also be interested in hearing from Edison plans on transferring the fuel from pools to these dry casks and maintaining security in the process. We know that overall decommissioning is an expensive endeavor. In anticipation of decommissioning costs, we know the trust fund has been set up. We'll get an update on the status of those trust funds and discuss whether or not we believe they're still sufficient to cover the decommissioning costs given the premature retirement of Senator Onofre as a facility. And finally, we'll hear from a representative of the established community engagement panel to ensure that the appropriate communication is taking place between the owners, operators of Senator Onofre and the surrounding communities. And even though this is our third hearing, we know that this is still just the beginning stages of what is surely to be a lengthy decommissioning process and timetable. So with that, Senator Hill, I invite you to offer any opening comments.
Happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. And with that, then, let's call for Tom Palmisano from Southern California Edison and the Honorable Tim Brown. Vice Chairman of the Community Engagement Panel and the Mayor of the City of San Clemente.
Good morning.
Good morning. Take it away.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I am Tom Palmisano, the Vice President and Chief Nuclear Officer for Southern California Edison. And this morning, I'll be taking you through a presentation which provides an update from our meeting last year, where Steve Pickett gave you an initial presentation on the decommissioning process and our initial thoughts on decommissioning San Onofre. And I look forward to today's discussion and your questions. So thank you very much. I believe you each have a copy of the presentation in front of you. So what I'd like to do to bring you up to date, first of all, I'd like to start on page 2 and talk about our decommissioning principles. Since Steve was here last year, we have completed quite a bit of the initial planning for decommissioning. And I think very importantly, Southern California Edison and the other co-owners of San Onofre have developed and communicated to the public and our other stakeholders our decommissioning principles. And I would just like to take a minute and talk about that. There are 3 key parts of our principles, the first being safety. And I think that first and foremost, we need to emphasize not only to the committee, but to the broader public that we will safely decommission San Onofre. We take the responsibility very seriously to protect the health and safety of the public and our workers, and everything we have done as we've operated the plant and certainly as we have prepared for the decommissioning, we do with safety in mind. The other key bullet there is we are going to safely move the power plant's spent nuclear fuel into dry cask storage until the government, the federal government, has an approved long-term storage option. We are responsible for safely handling and managing the spent fuel and ultimately turning over to the Department of Energy for the ultimate transport off-site and disposal. So those are the key elements of safety. Secondly, stewardship. We have been partners in our community for many years operating San Onofre Units 1, 2, and 3 and the early decommissioning of San Onofre 1. And we take the stewardship principle very seriously. Our intent is to leave our neighboring communities better off for us having been there for many years, generated power for the benefit of the ratepayers of the state of California, and we want to leave the community better off. The other part of stewardship is we intend to spend the Nuclear Trust Fund wisely. The ratepayers have contributed over the years to a nuclear trust fund. We have managed that effectively to grow that fund far beyond the contribution levels to where we have announced that we are fully funded for decommissioning of San Onofre. And it is our job now to make sure over the ensuing years as we decommission the plant, we manage the expenditures wisely, continue to manage the trust fund wisely as it continues to grow. And at the end of the decommissioning process, we will return any unused monies to the ratepayers. So as we balance decommissioning, the timing of decommissioning, the options we face, also with what we don't need to spend on safely and timely decommissioning the plant does get returned to the ratepayers. So those 3 key bullets emphasize the stewardship principle. And then the last principle we think is very important and that's engagement. I think there were some comments last year about the importance of public engagement and a community engagement panel or community advisory board. Mayor Brown is going to speak to that from his perspective as vice chair of the panel. But from Southern California Edison and the other owners' perspective, we think it is very important that the decommissioning process is inclusive, forward-thinking, and involving diverse stakeholders. We are responsible for the decommissioning and the safe decommissioning and the appropriately managed expenditures, but it's important that we engage with the community to get their input so they understand the activities that take place, and where there are options available to us, we listen to public comment on what those options may be. So the engagement principle is particularly important. So we developed and communicated those principles. If you go on to the next slide on page 3, we also have a broader public engagement and education plan. The community engagement panel that Mayor Brown will speak of in a few minutes is just one aspect of a broader plan. We have decommissioning previews. When the plants used to operate, we would have open houses where we'd go out in the public communities in the evening and talk about what operating the plant meant and answer questions of the public. We are re-engaging with the public, doing the same thing on decommissioning now to explain what decommissioning is. We are going to open the facility outside the security protected area to walking tours for the public. So we'll take them around the perimeter of the facility and show them where the spent fuel pool buildings are, where the dry cast storage installation is, and talk about what buildings are going to be removed as a way to reach out to the public and educate them. We conduct private tours for key stakeholders, whether they're local representatives, members of our community engagement panel, other officials who would like a more detailed internal tour. We have done that and continue to do that. And we've created a songscommunity.com website, which we continue to post a variety of information. They may be at an industry level or a song-specific level on decommissioning. And we'll continue to do that as a way to make information available to the public to stimulate the discussion and the conversation around what is decommissioning, what are the public impacts, and answer questions. So as we go on now, what I'd like to do now starting on page 4 is give you an update. Over the last year, we've been able to complete a lot of the initial planning, and I want to bring you up to speed over the next several slides about what our current plans are for decommissioning San Onofre and what is going to be in the documents we submit to the NRC in September. Just as a reminder, page 5 is actually a slide from an NRC presentation, and I know Michael Weber, a Deputy Executive Director of the NRC, I believe, met last year with the committee, so you probably have seen some of this. But very simply, what this slide shows from the NRC perspective is on the reactor decommissioning process. The column on the left where it says licensee, that is Southern California Edison. We are in the first 3 blocks. We've completed initial notifications of decommissioning. We've removed the fuel. The decommissioning report are the documents we are about to submit in September, particularly the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report. We are not yet authorized for the major decommissioning activities. That will come after the NRC reviews and accepts our documents. And then decommissioning occurs, license termination plan, final decontamination, final survey. Those activities are allowed to take up to 60 years by the NRC's rules. We do not intend to take that long. We are submitting a 20-year plan for those activities, and I'll show you that in a minute. The center column is what the NRC does. The public review meeting will be held likely in the 4th quarter following submittal of our documents. The NRC has a 90-day period to review our documents and ask us questions. Then during the decommissioning process, the NRC provides oversight. At the end of the decommissioning, what would be called in the NRC's terms the radiological decommissioning, there will actually be license amendments submitted and opportunities for public reviews, potentially public hearings, et cetera. That is at the back end of the process. Then on the right side, you see opportunities for public involvement from the NRC's perspective. We have many more opportunities from our perspective, and they've labeled it as information, commenting opportunities, or actually at the end a hearing request as the process is completed. If you go on to slides 6, 7, 8, and 9, I just want to refresh everybody's memory. Slide 6 shows you an overview of the property. The power plant itself is on the narrow strip of land between the ocean and Interstate 5. On the east side of Interstate 5 is an area we call the Mesa. Slide 7 shows you a good overhead of the power plant itself. You see in the lower center the two active, the formerly active units, San Onofre 2 and 3. Unit 1 has been removed partially, so it's no longer in the picture. This is the part that is subject to the NRC decommissioning process. If you go on to page 8, you see an area we call the Mesa. This is property we leased from the Navy for warehouses, storage facilities, a training center. This is not part of the NRC decommissioning process. It is subject to being removed under the terms of the Navy lease, and the decommissioning funds have money for that, but the NRC is not involved in that aspect on the Mesa side. And there's no radioactive material over there. This is largely storage. And then slide 9 shows you a close-up of the units 2 and 3 in some detail so you can get a feel for the complexity of the plant, the complexity of the task ahead for the decommissioning process. So slide 10 is really the result of the last year of planning, and I want to take a minute on this because this really lays out what the plan is for decommissioning San Onofre 2 and 3. As I said, we have 60 years by NRC regulations from June of 2013. We don't think it is appropriate for San Onofre to take that long. It is not necessary for the trust fund to mature. So we have laid out an initial 20-year plan for the decommissioning of San Onofre 2 and 3. The top timeline is not to scale. To the left of the bold vertical line is really between now and January 2016, and to the right is the balance of the 20-year timeline from January 2016 out to 2033. So I've kind of manipulated the timeline. I really want to focus on the first two and a half years up to January 2016 at this point. And I'm just going to narrate very quickly what these different lines are. And certainly if you have questions, it'd probably be useful as I go, just feel free to ask. What is shown as system retirement, if you go back to January 2013, the plants had not operated for over a year, but the plants were fully capable of operating. Fuel was still in the Unit 2 reactor at that point. We had defueled Unit 3 for other purposes, but we had all of the chemicals and oils and gases on site in equipment and storage tanks to allow the plant to operate should the plant have been restarted. So what system retirement is I systematically, and the staff that we have, we go through every system and we follow an NRC process for this, deciding is the system needed in a decommissioned state to cool the spent fuel pool and contain any radioactivity. If it's not, I retire it. An example would be the turbine generators. They are not a safety system. They're not needed for spent fuel. They're just a power conversion system to convert steam to electricity. So I've retired those systems, and one of the important things is beyond radiological hazards, I have chemicals and oils and gases on site, had them on site, so we systematically drain all that and dispose of that properly. So those activities are all part of system retirement. I also de-energize any unnecessary equipment, again, preparing the plant for decommissioning as well as reducing any hazards to the public or to our employees. So that's what system retirement implies. The next term is kind of interesting, a term cold and dark. This is a term used in the industry, particularly in the EPRI documents. And this really talks about preparing the plant for the major decommissioning. This is really shutting off all the power, all the energy sources. So we get down to where we just cool the spent fuel pool, we take care of the dry cask storage, and we systematically turn power off to every other piece of equipment in the plant. So eventually a major decommissioning contractor can come in and demolish the plant. So those are linked to system retirement. All those activities are going to take till about mid-2015. I'm showing you a representation of the schedule here. So by January 2016, I'm ready for final NRC approval to start the major decommissioning phase. Related to that, you see two sublines there, decommissioning power ring. One of the things we've learned over the years from industry experience, there's been a lot of decommissioning experience across the country and in California, particularly with places like Rancho Seco and Humboldt Bay. We have benchmarked virtually all these sites. Either we visited them or we've talked to them on the phone if they're idle sites. And one of the early things you do is you put in a new power ring and, again, turn off all the installed plant equipment so you can efficiently tear down what exists. Spent fuel pool islanding, this is a term used talking about reducing any reliance on installed plant equipment and ocean cooling for the spent fuel pools, which I'm still relying on today, but over the next year, I'll put in standalone cooling systems that are appropriate for the heat load. The fuel has decayed quite a bit now, that will allow me to turn off the remaining plant systems to start eliminating any need for drawing water to and from the ocean. And that's called a spent fuel pool island. And this will be in service until sometime in 2019 when I complete offloading the spent fuel pools. So that's what that term means. That, given the significance of properly managing spent fuel, it's an important activity, which is why I show it on the bar chart. Permanently defueled technical specifications in the E-plan or emergency plan submittal. I need to change the NRC's licensing basis. My licensing basis today is for a fully operational 2-unit plant that could operate 100% power. Well, these plants have been defueled. They will never operate again. My license effectively has been modified by the NRC. I can no longer load fuel into the reactors, nor can I operate the reactors. So I now need to change the NRC documents that reflect that licensing basis. A lot of the equipment that was needed for operating reactors are no longer needed, so I need to formally delete those from the licensing basis. These submittals are part of doing that. Likewise, the current emergency plan is designed for a full-scale emergency from a reactor operating 100% power. That is no longer needed nor appropriate. We don't present that level of risk to the public. So what's part of the decommissioning process is to revise the emergency plan to recognize that reduction in risk to the public, focus on events starting with spent fuel, not operating reactors. We have made both of those submittals in March of 2014, and that is under an NRC review process that nominally takes about 12 months before the NRC approves that. I can't implement those changes without formal NRC approval, so those reviews are in progress now. You see a series of lines there that are called the ISFSI project. ISFSI acronym talks about Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation. This is the dry cask system. We already have 51 dry casks loaded with Unit 1 fuel, Unit 2, and Unit 3 fuel. And one of the casks has what's called greater than Class C waste from the Unit 1 decommissioning that's been partially completed. What we do need to do to finish offloading the Unit 2 and 3 spent fuel pools is we need to purchase and expand our facility and add an approximately 100 additional dry fuel storage casks to handle the Unit 2 and 3 fuel that's currently in the pools. And I'm going to show you a slide that breaks that down in more detail in a minute. We anticipate making our decisions on that expansion and the vendor selection in August or September of this year, and implementing a project that will allow me to fully offload both spent fuel pools by mid-2019. Which is a very timely offload of the spent fuel pools and gets all the fuel into dry storage casks at that point. You see 3 diamonds there, IFMP, which is your Radiated Fuel Management Plan, DCE, Decommissioning Cost Estimate, and PSDR, Post-Shutdown Decommissioning Activities Report. Those are 3 NRC-required documents that are unique to decommissioning. They're required to be filed by June of 2015. We intend to file them in September of 2014. The documents have been drafted. We've shared them with our community engagement panel to get any final public comment and input to them, as well as we've posted them on our website for the public in general to see them and provide any comments. Those documents are required to be filed with the NRC, reviewed and accepted by the NRC, and I'm going to talk about each one in a little more detail before I can start the major decommissioning. So everything I'm doing to date with system retirement, temporary power, are preliminary activities to set the stage, if you will, for major decommissioning. And then should mention historical site assessment, site characterization. This is really reviewing the site's history and doing some initial assessment of where any radiological contamination would be from 30+ years of reactor operation for Units 2 and 3. This forms the baseline for the remediation plans for the decommissioning, as well as a baseline for ultimately we'll have to perform these surveys to demonstrate we've cleaned up the site or remediated the site to NRC standards from a radiological standpoint. So we're starting those activities now. All the industry benchmarking we've done, whether it's Humboldt Bay or the Zion plant in Illinois, Maine Yankee, has told us you need to do this early because this starts to define the scope of the work that you need to do. That's an overview of the 20-year decommissioning plan. What is to the right of the line then is not planned out nearly in as much detail. What you see is the fuel offload campaign labeled ISFSI offload campaign going out to mid-2019. You see starting in early 2016 the start of decontamination and dismantlement. We will select a broad contractor with good experience in decommissioning to do the bulk of that work under our management and oversight. That's about a 10-year window is our current planning estimate for the major decontamination and dismantlement of the facility. Followed at the end of 10 years, you see completion of remaining site restoration work. That would be after the site is remediated radiologically, taking down buildings, restoring it to a condition as specified by the Navy, who owns the land, and then going through the NRC's license termination process, which is about a 3-year license amendment process with opportunity for public comment and hearing before the site is finally released by the NRC. So that's an overview of our 20-year plan. Page 11, I'm not going to really focus on that. I've extracted some milestone dates on that for your information. Certainly, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to explain them, but it kind of takes that 20-year plan and gets you some more specific dates. I think one thing that is important to talk about, though, is what's left after 20 years. Right now, there is no place to ship used nuclear fuel in this country. It's a Department of Energy responsibility. We can talk at length about Yucca Mountain and why that is not in place, but the reality is at the end of this 20-year decommissioning, the NRC license will be terminated, but in reality it'll be reduced down to just the independent spent fuel storage installation, and that will remain an NRC licensed facility responsibility of Southern California Edison to manage that spent fuel until some point in the future when the Department of Energy removes the fuel from the site. Our current planning assumptions are important. We're anticipating at an industry level, the Department of Energy starts picking up fuel from the industry in the year 2024. I think specifically we're anticipating 2027, 2028, they start removing fuel from songs, but it's going to take until the 2048, 2049 timeframe by the NRC's current plans before all the fuel is removed from the San Onofre site. So at the end, you see the final date of 2024 to 2049, spent fuel transfer to Department of Energy. Then you see dates of 2050, 2051, 2052. That is when the ISFSI would be decontaminated and dismantled, and the final site restoration done, and the final license termination of the ISFSI facility. So one of the things when we discuss this at the community engagement panel, other public forums, we want to make sure we're very transparent and clear what will be the condition after 20 years and what will be the condition at the end of the ISFSI demolition. With that, I'm going to go on and talk briefly about the 3 required regulatory submittals that we're in the final stages of reviewing with our community engagement panel. The first is the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, and these are driven by NRC requirements. On page 14, I show you a simple description of the bases, telling you really where the requirements are housed that the NRC publishes, starting with 10 CFR 50.82 and then an associated NRC reg guide. This is a relatively high-level document. We have reviewed the documents submitted by all the other plants that either have decommissioned or are decommissioning. This document would be on the order of about 50 pages, and its intent is to provide the description of the planned decommissioning activities, the schedule for those activities, much like I've already narrated. There'll be more detailed dates in it, of course. Summarizes the expected cost from the site-specific decommissioning cost estimate, and discusses the environmental impact. And I'll talk a little more specifically about how the NRC handles the environmental impact report. On page 15, you see a little more detail about what the report actually contains. There are 3 methods that the NRC approves for decommissioning. One is called entombment, which is not used for commercial reactors. The Department of Energy for Department of Defense production reactors would entomb a reactor, remove all the fuel, the radioactivity, and just fill it with cement for many years. That's not an option for us. Safe store, which is where you go into an indefinite period of just defueled and letting radioactivity decay and the truss will mature. We don't feel that's appropriate nor necessary for us. And the other method is what's called D&D, or decontamination and dismantlement. That's where you actually decontaminate, remediate the radioactivity, then dismantle the radioactive components. That is the method we have selected, and we will start that fairly quickly in 2016 following NRC approval. EIE is the environmental impact evaluation. What the NRC requires at the point of start of decommissioning is to do an environmental impact evaluation and really judge whether the planned decommissioning activities are consistent with what has already been reviewed and approved for the site. You know, the site already has an environmental assessment that was done as part of the initial licensing for the site and has been kept continuously updated through the operation of units 1, 2, and 3. So what the NRC requires then is for me to do an environmental impact evaluation against my current environmental assessment for the operating plant. The NRC has done a generic decommissioning environmental assessment, and that's published because they've looked at the generic decommissioning activities and looked at the impact on the environment, decided what's acceptable, and then also requires us to look at a couple specific topics like endangered species, environmental justice, some things that are very specific to the location you're in. At the end of that, if we conclude in the environmental impact evaluation that the impacts are acceptable, and I'll show you a little more detail on that, we have an extensive report that we complete, keep on site, the NRC has available for inspection. I summarize the results in the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, and then the NRC reviews that as part of reviewing the report. So that's what the EIE talks about. And then if the evaluated differences are greater than small, in our case, all our environmental impacts are judged as small, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. If they were not judged as small, additional environmental reviews may be necessary, including a full environmental review or a license amendment. That's not our case. And then it talks about planned compliance with some existing requirements. I won't talk about them all, but both some federal requirements that the NRC requires, as well as some state and local requirements, California Lands Commission, California Coastal Commission. We need to comply with all of the current requirements during decommissioning, as well as future requirements as we go through the California CEQA process. It also summarizes the cost, and our current estimate we've just completed is $4.4 billion. You'll see more detail on that in a minute. So again, this is a relatively high-level 50-page document. Now, on slide 16, let's talk just a minute about the environmental impact evaluation, because this is certainly one that we've talked more to the community engagement panel and the public about. You see the bases for how the NRC implements the NEPA process, the bases documents that we work from, that I'm required to work from. The content of the document, again, we need to summarize it. This in the PSTR. This is a 400-plus page evaluation that the NRC has available for inspection, and we've made available to the community engagement panel and the public. Key impacts are found not to be detectable or so minor that they neither destabilize nor alter any important attribute of the resource. Again, this is judged against the fact that the plant's already been there and has been operating for a number of years. We're looking for impacts that are different than what's already been assessed. It confirms the differences are either bounded by the generic or the existing site-specific environmental impact statements. And if they're not bounded, we would have further work to do. The definitions that the NRC uses, small, moderate, and large, I won't read those to you. I think page 18 is the key here. So we've completed the environmental impact evaluation. We had a firm with outside expertise do this, and I had a second firm review this, as well as our own environmental department. There's some key assumptions for us to be able to say the environmental impact is bounded by both the NRC's generic statement as well as our site-specific environmental impact statements. One assumption is the ocean conduits for Unit 2 and 3. These are the large intake and discharge pipes that are buried on the seabed, will not be removed as part of decommissioning. Okay? That is consistent with the decision that we made and that the State Lands Commission accepted for the Unit 1 decommissioning. Fundamentally, there's more environmental impact to taking out thousands of feet of piping as opposed to abandoning it in place. That's essentially what that says. No blasting will be used in decommissioning. Some sites around the country in less sensitive areas have used explosives to take down the big heavy concrete buildings. We will not do that. That would be an unacceptable environmental impact in our location. We'll maintain the existing land use designations. In other words, we're commercial industrial today, so during the decommissioning and the end use is expected to be consistent with today's land use designation. And you can see limits on dewatering, comply with the existing permit, no excavation greater than area previously excavated during original construction, so we don't disturb any previously unexcavated areas. And we minimize air quality impacts. There are a lot more detail in the report itself, but these are the key assumptions that allow us to say all the impacts are small and we're within the analysis of both the generic statement by the NRC and our site-specific statements. And that'll be summarized in the PSDR and inspected by the NRC for that conclusion. Second document we need to submit is the irradiated fuel management plan. So, the PSDAR summarizes a decommissioning plan and talks briefly about spent fuel, but when the NRC created a requirement.
Senator Padilla.
I just wanted to clarify. So you do a EIS, you don't have the CEQA equivalent document? So a EIR as well? And is the concern on air quality as you take down the buildings, the possible contamination of the buildings becoming part of the air emissions?
Yeah, so let me clarify. Everything I've discussed meets the NRC's requirement. We now will go through the CEQA process, so there will be more environmental reviews done here.
You know, in some areas
Right.
It's more stringent.
Yeah, in some areas be more stringent. When it comes to air quality, there's a couple factors. One is just diesel engines. We have diesels on site now that are under air quality permits. As we do the more detailed decommissioning planning, the decommissioning contractor will use likely diesel-driven equipment. That will have to fall under air quality requirements, so that will have to be reviewed and permitted properly.
Well, the takedown of the building.
Well, now the dust issue. One of the bigger issues that has to be monitored closely and mitigated effectively is dust created in taking down the buildings. Now, the NRC's generic evaluation of dust, it'll be generated, but can be controlled and can be mitigated. We've reviewed our current planned activities, and we've concluded it can be controlled and mitigated such that the impact is no greater than small, and that's what the NRC test is. But two things, as we go through the more detailed planning, those conclusions will have to be continually reviewed and updated, and we're about to start through the CEQA process with the appropriate state agencies. Many of these same questions will be reviewed and asked again. So we're really early in the environmental review process.
I think it'd be helpful for Senator Padilla and the committee, unless it's further in your presentation this morning, can you make a brief comment on where that CEQA process overlays on the timetables that you've outlined to us thus far?
Certainly. To give you a quick picture, if you look at that 20-year timeline, we'll submit these documents to the NRC in September. I anticipate in September, October, we'll start engaging with the state agencies to lay out the time for the CEQA process. So we're about to initiate that dialogue with the Lands Commission, the Coastal Commission, in September, October.
Okay.
Final question. Was there concern or is there leakage of radiation into the soils? So when you either take down the buildings, that disturbs things, or possible contamination and runoff eventually into the ocean? Or
So I think there's two questions. Do I have current areas of contamination in the soils? Is that?
That would be it because of the problems in the leakage and the reason it was shut down.
So what we do on the 20-year timeline on page 10 near the bottom, when it talks about at the historical site assessment and site characterization, that's exactly what that is designed to ask and answer. So I'm currently doing a record search from day one of operation of units 2 and 3, and I'll combine that with unit 1 and say, where do I have any known areas that I may have had soil contamination? That's the assessment. The characterization will actually be a sampling plan. I will go sample areas to say where are any known areas, and quite frankly, even if we don't have any areas that we maybe cause contamination, I need to separate out for the future decommissioning what is maybe fallout due to weapons testing in the 60s. If you go around the country, I can find radioactive contamination that has nothing to do with the operation of nuclear plants. It's either naturally occurring or it's fallout from the weapons testing, et cetera. So the characterization identifies all that. So two things. I know what I have to clean up.
And that wasn't done when the plant was originally commissioned to establish that baseline.
Oh,
Looking at
No, I think a lot of that was done in the original licensing, but that goes back to the 60s and 70s. We're much more sophisticated today. So we'll establish the baseline that will both identify what we caused and what has to be remediated, as well as we'll factor in the planning to make sure as we decommission and dismantle the plant, we don't cause a further problem. So I think that's the second part of your question, to make sure nothing during the decommission.
Plumes coming out of
Right.
the long-term
Right.
into the ocean. Or
So that all has to be identified, remediated to the NRC's satisfaction before the decommissioning is done.
And assuming that eventually you would sell the property for some kind of use.
Well, the property belongs to the Navy. Yeah, I've got a slide
Would
later.
it go into
So-
the
so,
Pendleton?
Yeah, we're under an easement from the Department of the Navy, so the property will
actually a good
revert to
thing.
them. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
And before continuing with the presentation where you left off, just on the topic of the CEQA process, at this point, has a lead agency been designated?
We have not designated, or CEQA, the state has not designated a lead agency yet. We anticipate it would likely be the State Lands Commission, because they were the lead agency designated for Unit 1, because the initial environmental question is removal of the ocean conduits, and as I said, in Unit 1, State Lands Commission agreed to leave the conduits in place and abandon them in place as the more environmentally appropriate decision. So we're engaging with both State Lands and Coastal Commission. I would anticipate State Lands will be the lead agency, but that decision's not been made.
And when and how is that decision finalized?
I'll probably have to come back to you as far as the how. Again, we're going to enter the dialogue in September, October with the State Lands Commission and Coastal Commission, and I'll have to get back to you on exactly how that decision is made.
Okay. Well, we're going to be coming back to this topic at the conclusion of your presentation.
Certainly, certainly. So, page 20, I want to talk about the irradiated fuel management plan, and we have spent a lot of time with the community engagement panel and the public being very clear and transparent on the spent fuel storage situation. On the left side, you see a column labeled current, and that talks about the current situation with spent fuel storage for San Onofre. At the very top, you see two yellow blocks. Those identify the spent fuel assemblies that I have in the two spent fuel pools. So Unit 2 has 1,318 assemblies, and Unit 3 has 1,350. Down lower, you see the green shaded block. That identifies the spent fuel that I have in existing dry fuel storage canisters on the facility on site. I won't go over the numbers, but it's Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3 fuel. And then at the very bottom is a legacy issue from early Unit 1 operation. We actually have and are responsible for 270 fuel assemblies stored at a GE Morris facility in Illinois, and those will remain there. The center area identifies between now and 2019, we will transfer all the fuel assemblies at the upper left in the two spent fuel pools, and we'll load them in dry fuel storage canisters. So you see coming through that unshaded block, Unit 2 and 3 offload to dry fuel storage, and then you see the number of canisters needed for Unit 2 and 3 fuel and greater than Class C waste. So at the end of 2019, if you go to the far right, I will have Units 1, 2, and 3 fuel. I'll have 3,855 fuel assemblies stored on site in dry fuel storage, awaiting pickup and transport by the Department of Energy. And then at the very lower right are those 270 fuel assemblies that are in wet storage in Morris, Illinois. They will not return to the site. They will be picked up by the Department of Energy at the GE facility in Illinois. So the irradiated fuel management plan, it's one of the 3 required submittals. Page 21 shows you the bases. Again, must be submitted by June of 2015, and we'll submit this in September. This, again, is a fairly summary level document, and its real intent is to lay out specifically the plan we're going to use to manage spent fuel and demonstrate that we have adequate funding to manage spent fuel over the duration of the time on site. So that's the content requirement. Now, this document's a little different, the way the NRC handles it. For the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report and the decommissioning cost estimate, the NRC reviews and accepts those documents, but they do not approve them. The PSDR goes to the NRC. They have 90 days to review and comment, and I incorporate any comments, but at the end of that period, the document is essentially in effect, but the NRC does not issue a formal approval. The irradiated fuel management plan is different because it is fuel, it is spent fuel. The NRC will actually write a safety evaluation and actually approve my document. And for all 3 documents, I need to update them periodically if there are any changes. But I show you on page 22 what the NRC review criteria is. In talking to the NRC staff, the history of this document, it's really a funding assurance document. Once they realized the Department of Energy was not going to be taking title and moving fuel at a certain point in time, they created this requirement to identify appropriate funding requirements. So that's the approval they will really look for, is to make sure the funding is appropriate. Page 23, I surveyed a couple currently decommissioning plants, the Crystal River plant in Florida and the Kewanee plant in Wisconsin. These are both single-unit plants. They're smaller than either of the San Onofre 2 or 3 units. I just wanted to give you a comparative number of the amount of fuel assemblies. Their plans, Crystal River will offload all their fuel by 2019. Kewanee is going to be a bit more aggressive. They have less fuel to offload. They're going to offload everything by 2016. We will have both pools emptied by 2019. Page 24, I want to go on to the decommissioning cost estimate. This is the 3rd of the required submittals. So this is now a site-specific decommissioning cost estimate. We have done periodic decommissioning cost estimates over the years for purposes of ensuring the trust fund the funds for the trust were being collected appropriately. The fund was on track to mature to cover the cost of decommissioning. Now that we've actually entered the decommissioning process, this site-specific decommissioning cost estimate is much more detailed and is really the first site-specific estimate of the cost to decommission San Onofre. You see the structure of it. It describes the decommissioning plan, talks about the assurance of adequate funding, breaks down the cost in some detail by period, and outlines the cost for spent fuel management, license termination, and that's a term that is synonymous with radiological decommissioning, and site restoration. And site restoration would be the non-radiological, non-spent fuel cost of removing buildings once the NRC license is terminated. The key assumptions on page 26, I think, are important. All the fuels out of the spent fuel pool by 2019, that's an important assumption. All substructures removed. There's a couple things that are unique to San Onofre that drives our cost estimate up to the $4.4 billion value. The all substructures removed is different than other plants have typically had to do, and this is really a requirement of today's Navy easement. The easement, very simple language, and this easement dates to the early 60s, very simply says that we'll remove all improvements we made to the property. We're discussing that with the Navy as to whether that's appropriate, whether it's necessary, whether it makes sense. For purposes of being conservative, I've estimated that we will remove every improvement we've placed on the property. That would require very deep excavation, removing base mat material that typically is not removed. There's some environmental impacts. This is one that's interesting. On the environmental assessment, I've assumed that we'll reach a resolution with the Navy not to remove all that because environmentally that is probably more harmful than leaving some of the deep substructures. But from a cost standpoint, today, to be conservative, I've estimated that I do have to remove it. We will update the cost estimate once we reach resolution with the Navy on their desired end state for the property, since they own the property. Likewise, on ocean conduits, I've estimated from the cost estimate that I have to remove the ocean conduits. Environmentally, that certainly does not appear to be the right thing to do, but at least until I have agreement with the State Lands Commission, similar to what I have for Unit 1, I'll estimate the cost of that. Once when we get the final agreement in place and final approvals, then we'll update the cost estimate. So you'll see some conservative assumptions in the cost estimate. At this point, they're a little different than the assumptions in the environmental evaluation. I won't go over the rest of the assumptions. I think page 27 is important. This pie chart really shows you a breakdown of the $4.4 billion estimate. So the shaded dark green, the $2.112 billion, is license termination. That is the radiological decommissioning and the NRC license termination for the bulk of the facility, other than the spent fuel management piece, that remediates and releases the site for unrestricted use under the NRC rules. The orange, or I guess yellow, is actually spent fuel management. So that is the cost of moving the spent fuel pool and dry cask storage, expanding the dry cask storage facility, and managing that facility until its end, 2050 timeline roughly, when the DOE has removed all the fuel and I complete the decommissioning of the spent fuel storage facility. So that's the piece showing adequate funding to manage spent fuel during and after decommissioning until that's removed. And then red is site restoration. So once I'm done with the green, and I've terminated the bulk of the NRC license, it's really an option whether we remove the remaining structures. We certainly intend to. We intend to restore the site, to essentially a greenfield condition, or as specified by the Department of the Navy. So that's the money to complete the remediation or restoration of the site once the radiological piece is done. So that gives you a good overview. On page 28, the Navy easement, this is worth noting because this is different, say, than Humboldt Bay, somewhat different than Rancho Seco. Since the land is owned by the Department of Navy and the land itself is on an easement, the ultimate end state for the land will be determined by the landowner, the Department of the Navy. We will work with them. We will remediate the land to NRC standards. We'll remediate the land to the condition specified by the Department of the Navy. So there's some language in the easement that we're talking to the Navy about now to really say, what is your end use? What condition do you want the land restored to? And that discussion's in progress. That will probably take several years to reach ultimate conclusion. Doesn't slow me down up front, but my planning basis is I currently will remove everything that we installed until specified by the Navy for a different end state. Trust fund and regulatory oversight, page 29. This is a question we've gotten in our community engagement panel, so I included this. We have a decommissioning trust committee. It's a 5-member committee, 2 of whom are internal, 3 external, nominated by company management, confirmed by our board, and approved by the Public Utility Commission. So one of the questions we get periodically is, what is the oversight of the trust fund? So you can see the sub-bullets there. Regulatory oversight of how we spend the decommissioning money. Really, the Public Utility Commission has a very active role regulating all spending from the decommissioning trust fund. The NRC's role is particularly radiological decommissioning and spent fuel management, ensuring we have adequate monies available and we complete that process properly. The PUC takes a broader look and looks at the entire decommissioning plan, the entire trust fund, and making sure it is spent wisely and managed effectively. So significant oversight from the Public Utility Commission. The last 2 bullets just reiterate the NRC's role. Slide 30, there's a couple topics that are of interest to the public that I wanted to discuss here briefly. On page 30, I've just summarized. I talked earlier about the changes, that I've submitted to the emergency plan, recognizing the reactors are no longer operating, the reactors are no longer fueled. So we submitted in March of 2014 what we call a defueled emergency plan. This recognizes that accidents from a reactor at full power can't occur anymore because the reactors are no longer fueled or in service and never will be. This recognizes that the hazards to employees and the public really come from spent fuel in the spent fuel pool, and spent fuel in dry cask storage. So it's a tailored, comprehensive approach to safety and emergency response measures based on the permanently defueled condition. The emergency plan is being revised. I've got a proposed revision. The NRC has to review and approve that before I can implement it and make any changes. So that process has started. It's about a 12-month process. It was started in March of 2014. The proposed plan maintains the staff and ability to mitigate spent fuel pool events, dry cask storage events, and communicate and coordinate with off-site agencies. So the plan does not eliminate off-site activities. It restricts them based on the reduced hazard, and it's a risk-informed basis. One bullet I didn't put on there, the NRC has issued interim guidance, draft interim guidance, to all the utilities in decommissioning in terms of what a defueled emergency plan must consider, what changes are appropriate, and what the NRC's process is. And the NRC's current requirements for emergency planning are based on operating reactors. That's where their interim guidance they issued is important to give us the guidelines they would find acceptable. And that involves a couple of license amendments to change the plan, as well as some exemptions from federal requirements. That is all packaged together and is what I submitted in the March timeframe. And that is currently under review by the NRC. I think one important point from a local standpoint, we have a very effective interjurisdictional planning commission which has been in place. That funding and that involvement of that interjurisdictional planning commission will continue under the current requirements. And then as the NRC considers the proposed plan, I continue to maintain a fully capable emergency plan designed for reactors at full power until the NRC approves a revised plan. Page 31 and 32, I know there was a question on seismic issues update. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on that. We've completed, and we had provided the Public Utility Commission a letter giving the status of after we permanently close the plant, how we were going to disposition the ongoing seismic activities. I won't go down every line. As you can see, virtually all of it's going to be completed. Item 7 is going to be canceled, and not due to really the plant not operating. Some more technical information came to light showing that that aspect was not required, and we reported that to the Public Utility Commission. If you look on page 32, everything through line 12 is really all the seismic studies that we're doing. Virtually all to be complete, and line 6 to be complete shortly. Line 13 is an NRC requirement for a decommission plan for a spent fuel pool seismic checklist, which I'm completing as part of the emergency plan changes. Lines 14, 15, 16, and 17 are all related to what the NRC issued for post-Fukushima orders and information requests for operating plants. And the NRC has concluded and told the industry they are not required for decommissioning plants. So they rescinded all their requirements related to that. And with that, I just want to close with reiterating our decommissioning principles of safety, stewardship, and engagement. And everything I have covered with you other than, say, the seismic stuff, I've covered in depth in public community engagement panels and other public venues to make sure we're communicating clearly and we're listening actively for public feedback. So thank you.
I have a list of questions I want to get through, but I want to afford my colleague, Senator Padilla, Senator Block, to begin to chime in if you'd like. We do have the good mayor here on behalf of the community engagement panel who also has a presentation. So if there's some urgent questions, you can ask now. Otherwise, we can hear from the mayor and direct questions at both of them. Senator Block.
Things will be hauled out that way.
Okay, thank you. I do have a couple questions, but if you'd rather we defer till after the mayor. Okay, and I apologize, I got here late. I was at a lengthy breakfast meeting, but if you already covered this, please just briefly update me. Concerned about traffic in particular as waste is hauled and other things are hauled. What are the routes planned and what are the impacts on traffic likely to be?
Excellent question. Early on, I talked about we've completed a year of the initial planning. We have more detailed planning to do. So these are, what I've just summarized, these are relatively high-level, summary-level NRC documents, which lays out a 20-year plan. The phase we're moving into over the next couple of years, and no major decommissioning is going to start until 2016. We will select a contractor who will do the bulk of the work, and working with that contractor, we're going to identify more specific time periods for demolition, for removal of materials, including route planning. So we haven't developed the specific haul routes. To give you some insight, the radioactive materials will be hauled out of state. We use a facility in Clive, Utah for low-level waste. We also use a facility in Texas.
Via what route?
We don't have the specific routes. Typically, for the radioactive waste we ship during operation or today as we clean up some of our storage areas, we use truck transport and work with the appropriate transportation of local communities on those routes. The bulk, when we really get into the major dismantlement, there's going to be a lot more material. We need to do both highway route planning and rail planning in terms of how we're going to ship the material. We haven't gotten there yet, so we'll have to answer that question.
San Diego would like to see the waste go east or north and not south.
We appreciate that. We appreciate that.
San Clemente would like to see it go south.
Yeah.
Frankly.
I'll guarantee it's not going to go west, at least, not in the near term.
I was going to say, don't rule out the western option.
There you go, yeah. So.
And one other question, if I could, and that is the cost estimates you have, the $4.41 billion. If that turns out to be a low estimate, and I'm not sure that it will be, but if it does, where will the additional dollars come from?
So a couple comments. I've made that a very conservative estimate. You may have caught some of the comments about I made some very conservative assumptions. I fully expect that estimate to go down. And we're fully funded today to cover $4.4 billion. In the unlikely case that more money was needed, and I think the state has experience with this with Humboldt Bay, with Pacific Gas and Electric, there's a mechanism with the PUC essentially to go back with an updated cost estimate and talk about future recovery from ratepayers. So, that mechanism exists. That's typical of most regulated jurisdictions in the country. I think, again, Pacific Gas and Electric has set that precedent with Humboldt Bay with the PUC. We don't anticipate being there. Our estimate, I'm confident is going to come down as we get more detailed planning done, but that would be the mechanism.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Padilla?
The ratepayer issue. I'm glad you asked that question. 60% of my district are Edison customers, so that comes up regularly on how it affects all ratepayers.
I'm not an expert in rate.
So not the 4.1 billion. Is that paid for in some other way other than ratepayer?
No, the 4.1 billion, really think of two sources. The fundamental money to decommission the plant has been contributed by the ratepayers. Okay, that's been required. That's been approved
Built
by the
in our
public.
rates.
It's built into the rates. Okay, so now that's not a full 4.1 billion. So that's a source of part of the money. The other is we have effectively managed the trust fund and invested it wisely to grow it to the value that is needed to cover the decommissioning. So the ratepayer contributions, I don't have the number at my fingertips, is not a full 4.1. By prudent investments, we've matured the fund to its current value. Okay.
And the investors in Edison, their exposure?
I'm not an expert to really answer that question in terms of a shareholder exposure. What I would tell you, we've recently announced in our financial disclosures that we expect no more contributions from ratepayers to decommission San Onofre. The money that's been collected to date, the way the investments have been managed and the fund is growing are sufficient to cover the 4.4 billion cost.
Unless there's costs that you hadn't assumed.
If there's a change in the future, we would have to revisit that. And certainly we would look to manage the fund prudently as the first option.
I'll be following the CEQA process, so Senator Padilla, I think that was one of your questions on the timeline and how that works, and if State Lands Commission is indeed the lead agency.
I believe that's still to be determined, but that's the...
That would certainly be our intent, but to be determined.
Let's go ahead and invite the mayor to make his presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senators, it's a pleasure to be here today, and particularly it's an honor to represent the community engagement panel. I am standing here in place of Dr. David Victor, professor at UC San Diego, who has done an excellent job in leading the community engagement panel. As his vice chair, I'm here to provide an update. He is on a family vacation, enjoying himself. I particularly like vacations to Senate hearings, so this works out really well in contrast. A little background on the CEP. We are comprised, we were really designed to be a two-way conduit of information, to receive information as you're receiving today as elected officials, to promulgate that information to the bodies which we represent or interact, and then to come back with information and or questions for that. And so it's really designed to help enhance and communicate back and forth between the parties, almost a representative fashion, to help really bring the public to the front here. It's a volunteer body. No one is being compensated for their time. One of the things that has been important and sometimes hard to convey to the public is that we are not a decision-making body, and we do not make policy or take stances as such. And so we've even got to the point where now we're reading at the beginning of our meetings that just reaffirming that we are here to engage with the public, but not to make policy and or to take votes. But really what we're focused on is similar to you, is the interests of the communities and primarily the organizations we represent. And so we have a broad array of voices that are on the panel, and it has proven to be very informative to hear all the different insights that everyone has, and particularly the folks that they represent and the questions that they are bringing to bear. The impetus, if you look on page 2 of the PowerPoint, the impetus for forming the community engagement panel is it reflects the co-owner's desire to formalize engagement with the community. I think that previous to actually the decommissioning initiative, San Clemente had been ground zero for a series of, after Fukushima, we had a series of hearings and a little bit of a flashpoint for the discussion on nuclear energy. And so I was really encouraged by the formation of this panel to allow there to be a formal process to be able to engage with the public and give them a forum to hear them, have their voices heard. And then also for us to go back to our constituents and those we represent and make sure that they understood what we were hearing, help them understand that, and then come back with questions. It is considered a best practice in the industry, and it was established by the EPRI. And there are similar panels that have formed with other decommissioning and other nuclear power plants. And so we have been, although it feels as if it has been a learning process, we have certainly learned quite a bit, and only I think it's been no more than 7 or 8 months that we've been in action. And we've learned quite a bit on how to operate the CEP. The membership is comprised of a chair, a vice chair, a secretary, and 15 other members. Of course, I mentioned Dr. Victor as the chair, myself as the vice chair. The secretary is Dan Stetson, who's the CEO of the Ocean Institute out of Dana Point. And then the 15 other members, you'll see a list of all of the folks who are participating. It's a pretty broad spectrum. That we serve on 2-year renewable terms. The SONX co-owners wrote the charter and selected the groups that we were represented. However, by extension, those groups were simply represented by whoever happened to be the person in charge time. So I was the mayor of San Clemente, so therefore I was the person who was blessed with the opportunity to serve on the CEP. And likewise, the city of Dana Point, city of San Juan Capistrano, et cetera. And then all were invited to participate and all accepted. And so it's been great that the community has stepped forward, these elected officials, folks who are doing anything without remuneration because they're interested and engaged and want their organizations represented. You can see that we have we span a broad array of interests, and includes anything from academia, mayors, organized labor, schools, state parks, supervisors, and you can see by the list involved with this that the CEP members, we have County of San Diego, County of Orange are both represented. We've got local cities, City of Oceanside, San Juan, Dana Point, which I mentioned, a series of environmental organizations that have also, we have a group in San Clemente that has been against nuclear energy since before the decommissioning was announced. And then we also have a series of alternates. For example, I'll give you an example. When Sam Alivato, the mayor of San Juan Capistrano, came to the first meetings, material can be a little challenging at times. I'll be the first one to admit that. And after 1 or 2 meetings, he said, you know what, there's a member of our council who's a former commander of a nuclear submarine. I think he's more appropriate to serve on this body. And so he then asked for Larry Kramer to step in, who's his mayor pro tem, which he did, and the co-owners were okay with that. So we feel that we're widely represented, and that as these positions change over, for example, mayors are no longer mayors, that we feel we'll get different representation and different leaders that will be coming into the process. We'll have to get them engaged quickly and educated, but we hope that they'll be able to pick it up and be able to also continue to keep that information going back and forth. The approach of public engagement has really been designed to do 2 elements. We've had workshops that are designed that are very technical in fashion, and we've been able to hear from Tom and other experts that have given us a tremendous amount of technical data, and we've had to do a lot of homework surrounding those workshops, but no public comment of note. Then we have our public meetings where similar presentations are done. Then we have an hour of public comment in which we will hear members of the public who have their concerns. We're also always receiving questions from the public through the SONX community website, which we are contemplating, and myself and David Victor are having calls to coordinate how we're going to integrate all this feedback and how best to do that. But the public engagement has been important. For example, after these CEP meetings, I'll come back, update the council in San Clemente as to what's going on. I distribute to an email blast that in the city, here's what we contemplated, and send out video links. And so we're promulgating the information through the resources we have at our disposal. And we feel that formalized communication process is the best way to communicate the information, and then also for me to get questions back from the public that, frankly, are better informed than my own questions, which is kind of what I'm hoping for, is the point of it all. Our next regular meeting, where we'll have a public comment section, is going to be on August 28th, and it's going to be in the city of Oceanside. And by the way, the meetings move, and so we'll be in Oceanside to San Juan, up to Laguna Hills, San Clemente, and so it allows for all the members and also for the public around those areas to come and to participate. It's an important element that we wanted to make sure that we had locals coming from wherever we held the meetings. The shared goals we do have is that, you know, an interesting element of when I would engage with the public about the San Onofre decommission project, the vast majority of the comments and or concerns are really focused on when's the waste going to be removed. The decommissioning process itself is seen as somewhat of a technical, and they just kind of assume that's going to run its course because it's managed through the NRC, and whatever groups that do those things will do it correctly. But how long are we going to have the waste on site? And that, in a lot of ways, as a public official, you want to give the nice, fun answers, you know, the answers that are encouraging, that the public likes. That part's not so satisfying, in that it's outside the control of the co-owners, outside the control of the state, really outside of anything we can do. It's the DOE that's going to be answering on that. And so, you know, we really, what I've communicated to members of the public is we'll do everything we can to meet these goals, which is transparency, public education, focus on the matters which we can make a difference on, and then lastly, make sure that everything's as safe as we can. And, you know, we'll take the information that's given to us, but, you know, make no mistake about it. You know, politicians love to grandstand, and we love to challenge the, you know, Southern California Edison on as many of these things as possible. But the things that we found from our constituents is just really focused on waste removal and when that's going to happen. The one nice thing is a supplement is when I do have questions from members of the public, songscommunity.com has been a great resource to point people to. Questions about dry cast storage, high burnup fuel. You know, here's the website, here's the links. I am not a technical expert, but I know people who are, and you can go do your own research. Let me know what your questions are, and I will make sure that we ask those at the next community engagement panel. And then there's also some excellent opportunities within these repository of information, particularly with the panel when it's for the public meetings. We're allowed to, you know, there's some interaction there. There's, you know, building on different questions, extension, and so it's allowed for, the representation is big enough that we can actually interact, but also small enough that we're got, I think, a good representation of the bodies involved. But I think everyone on the community engagement panel, from what I've seen, is very committed to making sure that this is done safely, to ensuring that the public is heard, and that we, in terms of doing the best we can to ensure that the co-owners are adhering to exactly what they promised to when they combined the panel. So that concludes my remarks, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Great, thank you very much for your remarks and for being here, for your service on the engagement panel. Let me actually start by asking you a couple questions. From the outset of the panel to today, you know, great that you're fulfilling the role of asking questions and making sure information is out in public. What type of inputs or feedback do you feel you've had a chance to give to the co-owners, if I heard you correctly, as they're putting together the various documents that we heard the overview of today?
You know, the inputs is, a lot of what the inputs is around is what the public is interested in hearing about. For example, early on in the process, there was quite a bit of concern about high burnup fuel. And what it's allowed is, you know, I think that the co-owners were presenting this information. We're like, well, that's all well and good, and we do appreciate that information, but you know, I'm hearing from the public that they want to hear about these items. And so it's allowed, I think, the co-owners to help focus the information around germane issues that the public is concerned about, not what they think is important for us to hear. And I think that's been probably the most important part, is from the onset when we first started, I'll be the first to admit, meetings were a little dry. You know, it's difficult information to make it through. I know that Tom loves it. You know, I struggle. I'll be the first to admit. But it's allowed us, the inputs we provided is to be able to say, hey, listen, the public, although I do appreciate that you're providing this information, this is what they're concerned about: dry cast storage, high burnup fuel, transportation, you know, traffic issues, other things like that. And so we've been able to focus elements of our meetings on that. But we still do have things that we have to get done, which is we have to engage on the filings. We have to review the information, be able to get our questions on those. And so I'd love to say we can spend hours and hours and hours on these issues, but we've addressed them. And we feel like we've been able to achieve some closure on those items, allowing us to really stick to an important track of actually getting things done. It was important also, we felt as a CEP, that we were able to actually have conclusive results. A lot of the time on these informational hearings, you feel like you're just not, I'm hearing a lot of things, but what are we doing? Because electeds, we have a short attention span. And so we'd like to feel like we're actually accomplishing things, at some point. And so it's been nice to be able to shape the discussion to actually have, first of all, the co-owners be responsive to what we're asking for. Listen, this is what we need to hear. I appreciate you've got all these things to do, but the public has concerns, so please address these. And I think they've been responsive to that. And so that has been, I think, an excellent outcome in the process.
Good. And so glad to hear you say that, and either for your background, or maybe you can help convey this to the rest of the panel. You heard me say at the outset of this hearing, this is sort of the third in a series. First in a year, but third in a series. The first dealt with sort of what are the short-term impacts of the closure, if you will. How do we keep the lights on? The second began to explore the decommissioning process in general. But we were very clear that given the tentative timeframes and deadlines for some of these plans and reports to be submitted to the NRC, we wanted to make sure that the state had a crack at considering some of those key decisions and had an opportunity to give input before the co-owner's final decision on what to submit as part of a plan to the NRC. The concept of an engagement panel was something that I think pretty quickly in that second hearing was sort of agreed to. It made sense. I don't see a process that doesn't include a community engagement panel, so I'm glad to hear that it's up and running, and all the participants feel that it's worthwhile.
I feel like it has been very beneficial, and one thing I will say that's also been very interesting is we aren't a decision-making body, but to ensure that that we're responsive to the panelists' desires, we've done some informed polling, myself and David Victor, and by and large, the panelists feel as if, particularly on the community aspect, that is the most important outcome, that the community feels like they're being heard, and that on key issues, for example, I'll just use the dry cask storage. There's certain elements of the technical information that you have to communicate to the public. Listen, there are no perfect outcomes. We are just simply going to take the best possible one, the safest possible we can do right now. Conveying those choices can be difficult. And so that's where the community engagement panel has been excellent, because you can hear the Q&A going back and forth. Why are we doing this? Why is this happening? And then you can hear it start to make sense to all of those, and we hope that it's also making sense to those bodies.
No, and as difficult as it is, you'd rather have that process than, well, Edison submitted a plan, and they never ran it by us, and we don't know why they picked, this option versus that option. So, speaking of options.
Yes.
Appreciate you laying out for us, by the way, the fact that you're looking at a 20-year time frame, not a 60-year time frame, and all the reasons that have gotten into that. So in no particular order, when it comes to the D&D phase, is it primarily Edison employees that will be performing that work? Is it contractors, a combination thereof? Can you begin to speak to that a little bit?
It'll be primarily a contractor. I know last year you touched on staffing a bit. We've reduced from 1,500 people in June of last year to 460, half of whom are security. Our vision for this, when you look at this type of work, this is not normal utility work to demolish a plant. We really need to hire the contractor who both has the capability, the experience, the skill sets to bring in a workforce to demolish the plant. So the physical work will largely be contractors. The planning for demolishment will largely be contractors. We, SCE, and the co-owners will be responsible. We'll have a significant presence on site to provide management and oversight of the contractor to make sure it's being done safely, properly, and cost effectively. But the bulk of the work will be done by a contractor.
Okay. And I think I know the answer to this, but just to get it on the record, we'll get into more detailed questions in the financing side of the fund that's in place, the trust that's in place. I just want to make sure that decisions on plans and remediation and decommissioning are driven, safety first, as opposed to what limitations or constraints do we have on the fund? Is the status of the fund driving the decisions? Or
Not at all. Going back to our principles, the first principle is safety. And I'll tell you, my personal involvement here and on behalf of everybody in the company, safety will be the start and the end of the decisions on how to decommission San Onofre, how to handle and store spent fuel, how to transport low-level waste. It is going to be fundamentally safety.
I want to continue to have that on the record and emphasize. We'll get to the questions about the sufficiency of the fund in a minute. You mentioned in your presentation once-through cooling. And I think from the documents you shared, the amount of intake is down 96%?
Correct.
At this stage. So in what time frame or window do you anticipate that there will be no further intake?
We're analyzing that currently. Some on that simple 20-year timeline, some of those plant retirement activities and cold and dark activities, we're systematically going through what that remaining 4% is. For example, one of the biggest components is my continued use on ocean cooling for the spent fuel pool cooling system. I anticipate, not a firm schedule yet, but in approximately a year, I'll have the alternate cooling systems in place, and I will further eliminate some of that ocean cooling need. But I've got some miscellaneous other streams. We've had since the beginning a sewage treatment plant for the buildings. That is properly permitted but discharges out that ocean conduit. So I've got to come up with a plan that's properly reviewed and approved by the appropriate state and local authorities to probably go to a septic system as opposed to a discharge system. So I've got a number of things that once I eliminate spent fuel cooling, I've got some other streams, if you will, that I've got to do before I can totally eliminate the ocean cooling. I'm anticipating somewhere in the next 3 to 5 years we'll totally eliminate that. But that's a conceptual time frame at this point.
Okay. And next question I had, you began to answer, one of the questions I came into this hearing with is I appreciate the role of the NRC, but just by virtue of their title, we know that their priority and emphasis is on, the safety on the nuclear side.
Right.
And so what history, what experience, what expertise they may have through a decommissioning process over air quality impacts, water impacts, soils impact, et cetera, recognizing that, like you said, their experience is much more on operating plants, not the decommissioning of plants no longer in operation. Through Senator Paddilla's questions, we brought up what's going to seem to be an overlapping CEQA process. So how structured or lack of a structure is there on the collaboration between the NRC as a federal agency and the relevant state agencies to make sure that we're checking all the boxes in terms of environmental study, review, mitigation?
I'm not being a representative of the NRC. I really can't speak for them in terms of their structure and their interface. Having managed nuclear plants for years and working with the NRC with respect to San Onofre, as you said, their principal concern is protecting the public from a radiological hazard, whether it's spent fuel, high-level waste, low-level waste, and the appropriate requirements that surround that. They do have a number of interface agreements with state and local agencies, in some cases for radioactive materials. They do expect, as you saw in my summary slides in the PSDR, I have to commit to continue to comply with all state and local requirements. So when it comes to something like air quality, the San Diego Air Quality Board, if I get the title right, really has jurisdiction there. The NRC expects me to comply with that. And we have a long relationship with state and local agencies, and we have some very talented environmental people in our company who interface regularly with that. So as the NRC looks at decommissioning, they will look to make sure I'm meeting their rules, and they will look to make sure I'm interfacing with the local, state, and local agencies, and they will then defer to the state and local agencies on what's appropriate. So that's essentially how that will work.
Okay. And I'm going to leap at this point to not just talking about water impact, air impact, marine impact, et cetera, but seismic as an element of that. You gave us towards the end of your presentation seismic issues update with several activities or reports being completed, some in progress, at least one that's been canceled, and others that have been rescinded. Those that have been rescinded, does that mean that never got past square one?
No.
Or does that mean those were also sort of canceled in process, or?
So that's on page 32. You're talking about items 14 through 17. Those are NRC things, and they were broader than just seismic activities. These were the post-Fukushima requirements. So let me just give you a little insight. The first two items, 14 and 15, were information requests from the NRC, and they were generally around evaluation of seismic and flooding hazards based on the learnings from Fukushima. And then the mitigating strategies were, okay, so, tell me about the current state of your design basis for seismic and flooding, then tell me about what mitigating capability you have for what they would call beyond design basis events. The plant certainly is designed for seismic and flooding issues, but Fukushima taught us you need to think beyond design basis. And then the two orders were very specific. The last one was about alternate instrumentation for the spent fuel pool. Let me give you an example why that's rescinded. Some of the learnings out of Fukushima, the operators at Fukushima got confused trying to prioritize their recovery actions from cooling the reactor core to depressurizing cooling the reactor containment to cooling the spent fuel pool. So what the NRC's concluded for a decommissioned plant, I have no reactor cores anymore. The reactor containment is no longer required because I have nothing in the reactor, so there's no prioritization to be done. I only have a spent fuel pool. So that order was specifically to put in some additional spent fuel pool instrumentation to allow a control room operator to prioritize amongst those three activities. Decommissioned plants no longer have three activities to prioritize. So that's an example why they rescinded it. So the NRC has rescinded those orders on Fukushima and the information requests for all the decommissioning plants because as they looked at what happened, they really don't apply to us anymore. So that's why they rescinded. It's not a seismic question particularly.
And on slide 31, the deep 3D geophysical survey project that was canceled?
Yeah, that as I understand it, I don't have all the detail at my fingertips. When this initially was laid out by the state for seismic studies to be done for San Onofre and I believe even Diablo, there was a thought that we needed to do some investigative work on this deep three-dimensional geophysical survey. More technical information had come to light, allowing us at San Onofre to propose that that was not needed. Everything else was, which has been completed or is going to be completed. I don't have the specific reason that was technically not required, but it was not based on not wanting to do it. It was based on it was not needed for the plant. This would have likely been canceled even if the plant had kept operating. It had nothing really to do with decommissioning.
And at the point of cancellation, had that project already begun, or?
Oh, well, everything you see is complete. I mean, this was one activity in a multi.
Right, but I guess before it was in canceled status.
No, I don't think we had, other than some early planning work, we had not done any physical work to my knowledge on that.
So it would have been not yet begun, or would it have been in progress at the point of cancellation?
The only thing I think that was actually done was just some early planning work. I don't think any physical work was done. But again, I'm not the expert on that. I would have to go get some more information.
Okay, and I'm inquiring because while I appreciate the status of the facility post-shutdown, nothing in the reactor is very different than when it's operating. From a seismic safety standpoint, there's still a concern because of the spent fuel rods on site.
Yeah, concern for the spent fuel pool, I understand. And that's why everything else has been completed or will be completed. Because again, this is just one element of a much broader review that was done.
Okay. Now, getting into the weeds here for a minute, you might have touched on it in your presentation, but can you expand a little bit on the different types of nuclear fuel, the high burn-up and the low burn-up fuels, and what that means for storage and other elements of planning as a result?
So with respect to spent fuel, the difference with high burn-up and low burn-up fuel is just think of it as the number of hours that we've operated the fuel assembly. We use a term, gigawatt days per metric ton of uranium. It's just really the amount of hours we've used the fuel. When the industry first started, if you go back to the Humboldt Bay and San Onofre 1 days in the 60s and 70s, Fuel design was in its early days. Fuel is generally run for a number less than, I think it's 44 or 45,000 gigawatt days per metric ton. Over the years in the industry, we got more experience with fuel. We designed better fuel. We designed better clad for fuel, which are the tubes that house the fuel assemblies. We were able to justify and have the NRC approve extracting more energy from the fuel pellets and basically using it for longer. That's what high burnup fuel is. So high burnup fuel is fuel that has been designed and built to operate longer than what would have been in the past low burnup fuel. Most of the plants in the country use high burnup fuel. More efficient, you draw more energy out of it, you create actually less waste if I can draw more energy out of a certain size fuel assembly. And so that's been a trend for probably 20 years. So that's what high burnup fuel is. The question that's arisen in discussions in the industry and with the community through the community engagement panel, is there any difference in storing and transporting low burnup versus high burnup fuel? Because high burnup fuel means the fuel has been irradiated more, potentially some differences in the strength of the cladding or the tube that holds the fuel pellets, okay? All the experience and research to date tells us it's safe to operate high burnup fuel. It's been safe to store high burnup fuel, both in wet storage and dry storage. And the European experience with transporting high burnup fuel, because we have not in this country programmatically, is safe to transport high burnup fuel. So the NRC considers the use, storage, and transport of high burnup fuel safe, and the CAS systems that we consider today are licensed for it. The NRC and the EPRI organization, which is our utility research arm, has continued research and monitoring of high burnup fuel in storage and transportation. So there's more work to be done, but the conclusion today, it's safe. Okay, so that's what the issue is. We do know there's more work to be done to continue to monitor storage of high burnup fuel. The question today on the part of, on the minds of some people is, now that the DOE has clearly not performed in any reasonable time frame, how long will this fuel be stored, and is there any difference, say, in 30 or 40 years after storage of either low or high burnup fuel when we go to transport it? Those are some of the questions that are being asked today. All indications are that it's safe now and will be safe then, but we will continue to research that as an industry, and the NRC will continue to research it as part of their licensing requirements.
Okay, and the final handful of questions come back to the finance part of the trust fund. You mentioned that the trust fund today has grown in its balance, if you will. I assume that's, aside from just interest-bearing accounts, are there market investments that have led to the growth of the fund, or how's that?
There's an investment plan for the fund. Again, if you go back and look at the slide where I talk about the committee that oversees it, the 2 internal, 3 external, you know, the fund is managed with a portfolio of investments. So, you know, the fund is appropriately managed such that there's not too much risk, but there's also growth opportunities. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. We can provide you the numbers of what the ratepayer contribution is versus what the growth in the fund has been to get it to the $4.1 billion, but it's been very effectively managed.
Okay, well, I'd be more than interested in seeing that, depending on the performance of the fund. Maybe that's something CalPERS and CalSTRS can learn from. Depending on the performance.
I'm not a finance guy, but we can certainly take an action.
But in all seriousness, going forward, if we were to suffer another recession, hopefully not like the one that we're just coming out of, but that would compromise the balance of the trust fund. How have we measured against that, hedged against that? But whether it's costs going, you know, beyond what we expected, despite your conservative assumptions, or the balance of the fund being compromised because of market exposure, you know, if we create a gap, it does beg the questions of how do you fill that gap?
And the NRC has an annual process where we have to report the trust fund balance against the cost estimates, and the PUC has a triennial proceeding where we do the same thing. And we're about to make a filing with the PUC for the decommissioning plan, so they will, as we start in the active phase of decommissioning, provide frequent and intrusive oversight of the decommissioning fund. So that needs to be reconciled on a regular basis about where's the fund, what's the cost estimate, what's the expenditure rate, to assure that the fund can cover the planned expenditures, or there's a plan to make up a shortfall.
And does federal or state policy dictate if there is a shortfall, who's liable?
That would be a PUC issue, California Public Utility Commission. from an NRC standpoint, we, the licensee, are responsible.
So that would be just to be determined in the event of that happening, or is there a standing policy as to who's liable?
I personally couldn't answer that question. We'll have to get you an answer for somebody who is more versed in the rate-making process.
Okay. And I raise it because history shows us that the norm has been more cost than fund balance.
Yeah.
Welcome, Senator Fuller. We've had a lively, just shy of 2 hours here, and we, just for your edification, Senator Padilla, Senator Hill, and Senator Block have all been sort of in and out during the course of the hearing today.
Some of it on the television, and, but busy day today.
Good. Well, our two panelists are still before us. I invite you to offer any comments or ask any questions you'd like. I'm sort of winding down with my questions at this stage.
I'm actually fine, so I'll just chime in after we figure out where you are. But I think at this point, my staff has felt this was a great hearing. We appreciate you doing it, and we've enjoyed watching the TV portions.
Any final comments from you gentlemen? Anything that we're not asking that we should be asking?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come and represent the community engagement panel. We also welcome if any of you or any of your members of the panel would like to come and attend a meeting. We're happy to give you a seat at the table and ask as many questions and have fun going over the material too. So this is just a small sample. There's plenty more.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, as much as you'd like. So, but you're welcome to come in.
Well, August 28th, I have a feeling we're going to be busy here in the Capitol, but let us know when the next one is after that.
We're doing it for years to come.
And I would just like to add, thank you for the opportunity. We've completed a lot of planning, and although the planning is really initial planning, we appreciate the opportunity to share our planning and listen to your comments and questions. Certainly, if you or your staffs have any questions or would like a tour, we are most happy to accommodate that.
Yeah, and there's probably going to be a couple of follow-up questions or requests for information that we have. One thing that I do believe will be helpful, it came up in conversation, is sort of this weaving into the timetables that you presented to us, the overlaying CEQA process. So that would be helpful just for the committee to be able to track the activity on an ongoing basis.
Very good. We'll be happy to discuss that. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, if there's nothing further, I want to thank you both for your time and your presentations today. We do have an opportunity now for public comment, an opportunity for members of the public to address the committee on the matter at hand that were not agendized to present. Is it Mr. Wetch, is it?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. On behalf of the State Association of Electrical Workers, I know the hearing today is focused primarily on the process for decommissioning, but because the committee analysis touches on a couple of other issues and because of some of the comments made by committee members relative to the impact on the workforce as well as on ratepayers, I'd just like to bring the committee's attention our belief that in regard to making both the displaced workforce as well as the ratepayers whole, that the settlement before the PUC is woefully inadequate in both regards. Over 1,000 employees directly have lost their jobs as a result of the mismanagement of San Onofre, and eventually another 400 will lose their jobs. But that does not take into account the hundreds, if not thousands, of other workers, small businesses, contractors, subcontractors, whose entire livelihoods are tied to San Onofre nuclear facility and have been for decades, who were displaced and lost their livelihoods as a result of what has occurred. And we do not believe that that workforce has been adequately addressed, nor has the workforce that lost direct jobs. In regard to Senator Pavley's comments relative to the impact on ratepayers, we do know that the PUC was forced to authorize the Edison Company to procure and charge ratepayers for between 1,000 and 1,500 megawatts of power to replace the power that was lost by the closing or the decommissioning of San Onofre. And originally, they were seeking $3.7 billion from ratepayers for the capital costs of related to songs. My understanding is within the settlement agreement, that figure is now around $2.6 billion that ratepayers will be hit with. The issue that we would like to see this committee look very closely at next year, and we will be petitioning our legislative representatives to pursue, is the idea that they're currently in arbitration negotiations with Mitsubishi, and that the any settlement that's recovered from Mitsubishi within the settlement agreement, as my understanding, is going to be split between shareholders and ratepayers. And I believe that that's an issue this legislature should look at very closely, in that if ratepayers on one hand are being asked to cover the cost of coming up with the additional power to replace San Onofre and the capital costs of songs to the tune of almost $3 billion, then the split that shareholders and the ratepayers get in that settlement with Mitsubishi is something I believe the legislature absolutely should be involved in, how that split is administered. We want them to vigorously pursue Mitsubishi, so we want to have incentive for shareholders, but the question is, how much do they deserve given the hit that ratepayers have taken, as well as displaced workers? So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take your comments into consideration. Any other members of the public wishing to address the committee at this time? Seeing none, thank you all very much for your time and attention today. This hearing is adjourned.